At the end of May 1941, Bismarck, the most powerful warship ever put to sea by Germany, rampaged across the Atlantic Ocean. After sinking the British Battlecruiser Hood in dramatic fashion, she was pursued by the Royal Navy's entire home fleet across thousands of miles, culminating in a brutal battle to the bitter end. Bismarck's voyage into the Atlantic started off as a raid aimed at Allied merchant shipping alongside the cruiser Prinz Eugen, but it became one of the most dramatic naval episodes of the war when the British capital ships Hood and Prince of Wales tried to intercept the German ships on the morning of May 24th. This battle in the Denmark Strait, one of the most heavily analysed and written about few minutes in naval history, will be the subject of its own video on this channel in the future. But for now, what you need to know is that at 6 AM a shell from Bismarck's 5th salvo sliced through Hood's deck and caused a huge explosion in the aft magazine. The battlecruiser was cut in half and sank quickly, with the loss of 1,415 sailors. Just 3 of her crew would survive. It was a devastating few minutes for the British, with the pride of their fleet sent to the bottom in just a handful of moments. But the Bismarck had not escaped entirely unscathed either. Of particular concern to Admiral Gunther Lutyens was a hit Prince of Wales had inflicted near the bow that had caused 1,000 tons of flooding and ruptured a fuel tank. The damage was bad enough for Bismarck's captain, Ernst Lindemann, to suggest that they return directly to Norway for repairs, but Lutyens overruled him, opting instead to stick closely to his original orders to end Bismarck's patrol at the French port of Saint-Nazaire. As the German battleship turned south to head for France, in pursuit was the Royal Navy's entire home fleet under Admiral John Tovey. Tovey's ships were spread over a wide area and soon struggling with the fact that on May 25th radar contact with the Bismarck was lost, leaving them without a precise location of the enemy battleship. Transmissions sent by Lutyens back to Kriegsmarine High Command allowed an approximate bearing to be triangulated, but an error in interpreting this data sent Tovey's fleet off in the wrong direction. By the time this error was corrected shortly after 6 PM, the home fleet was too far away from Bismarck to have any hope of catching it, unless the battleship could be slowed down. You can get a taste of commanding the Bismarck with today's sponsor, World of Warships Legends. It's a free-to-play multiplayer game for consoles that lets you sail and fight more than 400 ships from 11 different nations, with new vessels added every 5 weeks. The controls are easy to learn, allowing you to quickly jump into battles where you need to think carefully about your every move, in game modes ranging from 9v9 to a chaotic melee with 4 teams of 3. You can take command of small but deadly destroyers, well-rounded cruisers, versatile aircraft carriers, and mighty battleships like the Bismarck. World of Warships Legends has also just launched a brand new game mode called War Tales, featuring story-driven scenarios that can be played solo or with a group of friends, and will see you fight against the odds with whichever ship you like. War Tales is starting off with 3 dramatic scenarios, each offering its own unique story and intense battles. If you use my link to start playing World of Warships Legends, you can get a welcome pack with everything you need to get started in War Tales and regular gameplay, including 2 ships, 7 days of premium account, and some camouflages for your vessels. Thanks again to World of Warships Legends for sponsoring this video. That's where Force H came in. This smaller fleet under Vice Admiral James Somerville had moved north from Gibraltar to join the hunt, and it was now the only British group capable of intervening before the Bismarck reached the safety of France. When at 10:30 AM on May 26th an RAF reconnaissance Catalina flying boat caught sight of the Bismarck and reported its location, Somerville swung into action. He knew that his flagship, the battlecruiser Renown, was too weakly armed to stand up to Bismarck in a gunnery duel, which left the carrier Ark Royal as his chief offensive weapon. He turned his fleet to parallel the Bismarck's course, and then at 1:15 PM sent the cruiser HMS Sheffield to the south to try and establish radar contact with the German ship. Eager not to lose any time, at 3 PM Ark Royal flew off a wave of Swordfish torpedo bombers to attack Bismarck, but nobody thought to tell the pilot that Sheffield was now in the same direction, lying between the British and German ships. At 4:10 PM the leading Swordfish flight mistakenly attacked Sheffield, which had to maneuver wildly to avoid the oncoming torpedoes. Miraculously, the cruiser avoided any damage, as some torpedoes exploded prematurely due to problems with their magnetic detonators. The planned attack on Bismarck was abandoned. By the time Ark Royal was ready to launch a second strike, this time with the more reliable contact detonators fitted to the torpedoes, time was running out. Sunset was fast approaching, and the chances of a successful air attack at night were much slimmer. If Bismarck was able to slip away into the night, by the morning it would be very close to the French coast and within range of Axis air cover. Determined to prevent this, at 7:10 p.m. a second wave of Swordfish led by Lieutenant Commander Tim Coode took off and sped southeast towards Bismarck. At 8:47 the battleship was spotted and the Swordfish moved in, attacking in small groups from all sides. Bismarck threw up huge amounts of anti-air fire to greet the attackers, but the Swordfish proved remarkably resilient. One aircraft was hit 175 times and still made it back to Ark Royal. German fire control, which was designed to hit faster moving aircraft, was also thrown off by the slow speed of the Swordfish, inhibiting the effectiveness of the AA fire. The last flight of Swordfish attacked at 9:05 p.m. Bismarck's Captain Lindemann ordered a hard turn to port to try and evade the torpedoes. The battleship swung round, but just too late. The very last torpedo clattered into Bismarck's stern, rupturing the steering compartment and jamming the ship's rudder at 15 degrees to port, sending the battleship round in a circle. In an instant, Bismarck's prospects of reaching France had evaporated, a fact that was soon clear to the crew on board. The rudders were jammed, all of the backup systems for moving it had failed, and neighbouring compartments were filled with water. Attempts by divers to investigate the damage failed due to the rough sea. Captain Lindemann tried to steer the ship using the engines, but struggled to maintain any kind of consistent course. To make matters worse, at 10:30 p.m. a group of 5 Allied destroyers approached from the northwest and began to harass the Germans, resulting in wild changes in course as Lindemann tried to get his guns pointing at the British ships while battling for control of his ship. But despite the crew's best efforts, it soon became clear there was no fixing Bismarck's steering, and so no way of reaching port. Admiral Lutyens sent a message to Berlin: "Ship unmanoeuvrable, we will fight to the last shell." He and 2,000 sailors then spent the small hours of May 27th preparing for what they knew would be their ship's final battle. The final action of the pursuit of the Bismarck began at 8:43 a.m, when King George V sighted the German battleship at a range of 25,000 yards. 4 minutes later, HMS Rodney opened fire, followed soon afterwards by the flagship. As the British ships sought to find their range, Bismarck responded, with its first salvos landing close to Rodney. This was an impressive feat considering Bismarck's wreck steering and the high winds made it an unstable gun platform. Despite the accurate German fire, the British battleships continued to steam head-on, hoping to bring the range to the Bismarck down rapidly. At 9:02, Rodney struck with devastating effect. A salvo of 16-inch shells raked the bow of the ship, knocking out the forward fire control, destroying the Bruno turret and wiping out most of the bridge, including Admiral Lutyens. Fire control for Bismarck's 2 stern turrets, Cassar and Dora, was taken over by the aft fire control position, led by Lieutenant Commander Burkhard von Mullenheim-Rechberg. Mullenheim-Rechberg tried to bring some fire down onto King George V, but it was increasingly difficult to get any accuracy as the situation on Bismarck deteriorated. His 4th salvo straddled the British battleship, but then at 9:15 a shell arrived and destroyed the aft fire control position, wounding Mullenheim-Rechberg and forcing the 2 stern turrets to fire on local control. This they did, struggling on as the barrage of British shells landing around them only intensified. At 9:25, Dora received a hit, causing a shell that was in one of its barrels to explode, killing several men and taking the turret out of operation. Cassar lasted a few more minutes before it too was knocked out. By 9:31 a.m, all of Bismarck's main guns were silent. Only a few secondary guns continued to fire as HMS Rodney closed the distance to just 3,000 yards and fired salvo after salvo into the battleship. At 9:36, the ship's mainmast collapsed after another hit to the superstructure. 9 minutes later, Anton was blown apart by a direct hit. The scene on board Bismarck was soon one of total carnage, but the ship remained stubbornly afloat, with only a small list to port. So the shells kept coming. The situation was hopeless for the Germans. With the most senior officers on board dead, it fell to Commander Hans Ohlers to take the decision that Bismarck should be scuttled to prevent it being captured by the British. Orders were given for all watertight doors to be opened and for the crew to abandon ship. But with the incessant shell hits, moving around the interior was tricky. In the aft canteen, nearly 300 crew were stuck, unable to move forward due to fire and with the hatch to the deck above having been destroyed. Ohlers entered the compartment and urged them to head astern and find a way to the deck. Everybody must leave the ship. She will be sunk. You cannot go ahead. It's all burning. Just as he finished speaking, a direct hit from King George V smashed into the canteen. More than 100 were killed instantly, including Ohlers, and dozens more were injured. But even though Ohlers was dead, the orders he had given lived on. In the bowels of the ship, Lieutenant Commander Gerhard Unack oversaw the setting of scuttling charges in the turbine room. The lower decks were relatively lightly damaged, which made them seem eerily normal compared to the carnage playing out on the upper decks. Unack and his team set the charges and then set off through the ship, winding their way towards fresh air. The British ships finally ceased fire at 10:21 am, when it became clear that the Bismarck posed no more threat and that shellfire alone would not sink it. Rodney and King George V had by this time hit their target an estimated 700 times. To finish it off, Admiral Tovey ordered the cruiser Dorsetshire to come alongside and fire torpedoes at 10:25. 2 torpedoes found their target, and Bismarck finally began to sink, with water beginning to come over the deck. At about the same time, the scuttling charges were detonating, creating a lot of uncertainty over what actually sunk the Bismarck. As Bismarck began to roll over, Unack and Mullenheim-Rechberg had both made their way to the stern and abandoned ship, swimming as far as they could from it to avoid being sucked down when the huge battleship finally slipped below the waves. At 10:36, Bismarck disappeared, sinking stern first into the unfathomably deep waters of the Atlantic. From a crew of 2,285 sailors, just 115 would be picked out of the ocean and would survive. For the Royal Navy, sinking Bismarck was a much-needed success after the devastating loss of Hood. It was the end of one of the most costly naval battles of the entire war. Taken together, the sinkings of Hood and Bismarck during Operation Rheinübung, as Bismarck's sortie was referred to, was in casualty terms the worst naval battle of the entire European war, and only 4 Pacific naval battles had a higher death toll. The loss of Bismarck marked the end of the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet as a menace to the Atlantic shipping lanes. Stung by the loss of Germany's biggest and greatest battleship, Hitler decided the risks in the Atlantic were simply too great, and the Kriegsmarine's surface ships would be largely confined to operations in the Arctic, where it was easier to support them with land-based air power. As the Battle of the Atlantic raged on for 2 years after the sinking of the Bismarck, the Kriegsmarine's focus would shift dramatically towards the U-boat arm. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.